Well, good morning from me. My name's Craig. I'm one of the deacons here. Excuse me just a moment while I make a mess of things for Simon and the band. And this is purely because I don't like to be stuck at one edge. I like to be somewhere near the middle. It's only serving me, I'm afraid. So this is the second in our short series that we're doing, looking at worship and different aspects of worship. John Burns started us off 2 weeks ago, before the snow. You remember before the snow? And he was looking at Psalm 23 and thinking about David and one part of David's character and worship in lament and how we worship in the wilderness and in the valley, perhaps. Today we're going to look at a different story about King David, a different aspect of David's character, and some of the other characters that are in this story as well, and a different aspect of worship. Today we're looking at freedom in worship. Okay, so we're going to take a look at that through this story from 2 Samuel 6. And I'm going to trust you have it on the screens because I can't see it at the minute. There it is. Thanks, Dave. So 2 Samuel 6, from the start. David again brought together all the able young men of Israel, 30,000. He and all his men went to Baalah in Judah to bring up from there the ark of God, which is called by the name of the Lord Almighty, who was enthroned between the cherubim on the ark. They set the ark of God on a new cart and brought it from the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill. Uzzah and Ahio, sons of Abinadab, were guiding the cart with the ark of God on it, and Ahio was walking in front of it. David and all Israel were celebrating with all their might before the Lord, with castanets, harps, lyres, timbrels, sistrums, and cymbals. When they came to the threshing floor of Nacon, Uzzah reached out and took hold of the ark of God because the oxen stumbled. The Lord's anger burned against Uzzah because of his irreverent act. Therefore God struck him down and he died there beside the ark of God. Then David was angry because the Lord's wrath had broken out against Uzzah, and to this day that place is called Perez Uzzah. David was afraid of the Lord that day and said, "How can the Lord ever come to me? How can the ark of the Lord ever come to me?" He was not willing to take the ark of the Lord to be with him in the city of David. Instead, he took it to the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite. The ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite for 3 months, and the Lord blessed him and his entire household. Now, there's more to this story. We're going to come to that, but I figure we should just pause for a second for a bit of background, because it's quite a complex story, and there is a bit of background to this. So the Ark of God, or the Ark of the Covenant, as we might know it as well, it's been out of action to the people of Israel for quite some time, a period of about 20 years. It was lost in a battle with the Philistines, and the Philistines had taken the ark as the spoils of battle when the Philistines had defeated Israel in that battle. And during the time it was with the Philistines, they had it for around about 7 months. During the time it was with the Philistines suffered from all kinds of disease and plague and all sorts of real nastiness. And what they were doing was they were moving it from place to place to try and overcome these bouts of disease and these plagues that were coming on them because of God's anger that the Philistines had this ark, this holy object, which was said to be the place where God literally resided when he was with the Israelites. And it was in the wrong place. It wasn't meant to be with the Philistines. It was meant to be with the people of Israel. So God was inflicting these plagues on the people, on the Philistine people in the various places that it was. And because of that, it was inflicting these plagues and this nastiness, tumors and hemorrhoids it talks about, depending on which version of the Bible you read, on the Philistine people. And eventually, after this period of 7 months while they've moved the ark around, the Philistine diviners say to the 5 leaders of the Philistines, we can see the parallels between this and what we know of what happened in Egypt, with the plagues in Egypt that we can read about in Exodus. And they said, you've got to send it back. So the diviners said, put it on a cart and send it back to Israel, or put it on a cart and send it away. So the Philistines put it on a cart. It was drawn by 2 milch cows, And along with a guilt offering, so a big pile of gold, essentially. You can read about all this, by the way, in 1 Samuel, chapters 4, 5, 6, and 7. You can get all of the real nitty-gritty, dirty details of what the guilt offering looked like and how they did that. I recommend it. It's a great story. So they put it on the cart with their guilt offering, and they sent them off. And the cart, the cows, headed straight for Israel without wavering. No pause, no deviation, straight back into Israel. And eventually, the ark's taken back to this guy's house, Abinadab, in a place called Kiryat Jearim. I think in this version it calls the place Bala, but it's the same place. And it stayed in this house, in Abinadab's house, for 20 years. And when it first got back, it was like a time of renewal when the ark came back in Israel. People turned back to God. The reason they'd lost the ark was because actually they were sinning against God and they weren't really focusing on God at all. They were trying to be an awesome people and overcome people in battle and the Philistines in battle, but they were sinning in the camp, and that was why they lost the ark in the first place. And when it came back, it was like a time of renewal. But they didn't really know what to do with the ark, so it stayed in Abinadab's house. So for more than 20 years, through the reign of Saul as king of Israel, the ark stayed there. And what's happening here is David has decided he wants to bring the ark back to his city, to Jerusalem. He's become king. He's had a period of settling in. He's had his kingdom elsewhere in one of the other cities. And now he's set up his new kingdom. It's like a fresh start in Jerusalem. And he wants to bring the ark home. He wants it to be near him. And he kind of wants it like it's an ornament and a thing to strengthen his new kingdom, his new kingship. It didn't go quite as planned as we've just read. A man's died, a faithful man who's been in and around the ark for a long time, one of Abinadab's sons. And David's angry and he's afraid. So back to the passage, Dave. Now, King David was told, "The Lord has blessed the household of Obed-Edom and everything he has because of the ark of God." So David went to bring up the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David with rejoicing. When those who were carrying the ark of the Lord had taken 6 steps, he sacrificed a bull and a fattened calf. Wearing a linen ephod, David was dancing before the Lord with all his might, while he and all Israel were bringing up the ark out of the Lord with shouts and the sound of trumpets. As the ark of the Lord was entering the city of David, Michal, daughter of Saul, watched from a window. And when she saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, she despised him in her heart. They brought the ark of the Lord and set it in its place inside the tent that David had pitched for it. And David sacrificed burnt offerings and fellowship offerings before the Lord. After he'd finished sacrificing the burnt offerings and fellowship offerings, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord Almighty. Then he gave a loaf of bread, a cake of dates, and a cake of raisins to each person in the whole crowd of Israelites, both men and women. And all the people went to their homes. When David returned home to bless his household, Michal, daughter of Saul, came out to meet him and said, "How the king of Israel has distinguished himself today, going around half naked in full view of the slave girls of his servants, as any vulgar fellow would." David said to Michal, "It was before the Lord who chose me rather than your father, or anyone from his house when he appointed me ruler over the Lord's people Israel. I will celebrate before the Lord. I will become even more undignified than this, and I will be humiliated in my own eyes. But by these slave girls you spoke of, I will be held in honor." And Michal, daughter of Saul, had no children to the day of her death. Now, I wonder what expectations you had when we said we were going to do a series of sermons on worship. Because when I first started thinking about it, before I'd put any real thought into it, other than knowing that we wanted to do something around worship, I thought maybe it would be a lot around, the huge positive sides of worship, that having your hand in the air and waving a flag at the front of the church, that lightness or otherworldness that might come with worship. That's singing out the psalms and hymns. And if you know Jesus, if you are a Christian, I'm sure like me, you really like to quote parts of the Bible that say things like, now the Lord is Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. So it's interesting, I think, that after some thought and prayer when we were putting this together and when we started to actually give these sermons, we started off with the wilderness and lament. And then today we've got a story which is talking about freedom, and we're going to talk about freedom today and freedom in worship. But part of this story is about David getting it hideously wrong, really, and a man dying. In the original, where we had this planned, we were also going to talk about, we're going to use the story of Cain and Abel for another one, which is another difficult story. So it's interesting that there are all of these different aspects to worship, and not necessarily what, well, I certainly had thought about when I first thought, let's do some stuff on worship. Now, I wonder if at the start of this episode in history that we've just been reading about in King David's life, I wonder what his expectations were. Because it seemed to start well. He'd gathered the able young men of Israel, and he'd gone to get the ark. They were to accompany the ark back to Jerusalem, and they're celebrating with all their might. That's what the passage says. But then it all goes wrong. Uzzah's dead, and he's angry and he's afraid, and he's probably quite confused about what's happened. See, the problem here is that there were rules around the ark. The detail of how the ark was to be constructed, what it was to be made up of, and what it looked like, they're all written down, and we can see them recorded in the book of Exodus. But it wasn't just about how it was built. It was about how you were to be around the ark, how you approached it, who could approach it, when they could approach it. If you moved it, how was it to be carried? It's via poles through loops on the side of it, in case you're interested. Again, you can go into Exodus and you can look all of this up. And after all, it was a thing of mighty power, and the Israelites knew that. And ultimately, that's why it had ended up in Abinadab's house after their mishap in battle and losing the ark, and then really not knowing quite what to do with it. So they'd stashed it in this guy's house, and he'd looked after it for the 20 years. And in that time, it had been out of action to Israel. And it seems like David and those around him, they'd forgotten what you're supposed to do to the ark. They'd forgotten the rules that were in place. And instead, what they'd done when they wanted to bring it back to Israel is they'd copied what the Philistines had done. Bear in mind who the Philistines were. It seems like during this period of history, the Israelites and the Philistines were perpetually at each other's throats, completely, totally, and utterly in battle with each other all of the time. They were kind of pitched in this piece of history, and if you read this in the Bible, they're kind of like the exact opposite of how the people of Israel are. And yet, David and the people around him had chosen to copy the way the Philistines had moved the ark, instead of following the rules that God had set out that we see recorded in the book of Exodus. And the passage describes it as angering God, an irreverent act. It would be easy here to say that David's intentions were good. He wanted to do the right thing. He'd just forgotten the rules. But I wonder, were they? What were his motives the first time around? It's not particularly clear from the passage, but I wonder what his motives were. Was this about celebrating God? Or was it that David just wanted the ark? I wonder if David and the people around him sought the ark, the strength of the ark, the power of the ark, without seeking God. I wonder if, like how the Israelite army, when they first lost the ark 20 years previously, just wanted the strength and power of the ark, they did that without first seeking God. It's quite clear that that's what happened in the battle with the Philistines. They didn't pray to God. They just said, let's use the ark. It's got awesome power. And they lost it. I wonder if this was the same. I wonder if it was a similar thing. David wanted this thing to be nearby him in Jerusalem. He wanted this to bless his new kingship in David's city. But I wonder if he was seeking that, almost like a trophy, without first seeking God. I don't know, you should read the passage again and some of the commentaries around it, see what you think. You can tell me if you disagree. But I wonder. I have to remember what the ark was. It was said to be the place that God resided. God spoke from between the cherubim on the top of the ark. It is an awesome thing, the very presence of God. But I wonder if they sought the ark and not the presence of God. I don't know. And that's why there were rules in place. Because we know from things we've talked about previously in our series on prayer and some of the things John talked about 2 weeks ago, in his things around worship, there was a way to approach God. And you had to be quite careful. And the timing had to be right. Because we need to be intentional in our worship, and we need to obey God. And even now, even in what we call the New Covenant, after Jesus has opened a way up to us to approach God through what he did on the cross, even now, we still have to be right in the way that we approach God, even for us. When laws and rules don't really apply to us in the same way, but we still have to go to God with the right heart and the right motives. I wonder here if David, like us at times, he was getting excited about the wrong things. Maybe he was excited just about the ark itself. Maybe he was thinking about his triumphal entry into Jerusalem. It's a pertinent subject as we're coming up to Palm Sunday and Easter Sunday in a couple of weeks. Maybe he forgot that bringing the ark home to Jerusalem meant the very presence of God. I wonder how often in my day-to-day life and in my worship of God, I do things with the wrong motives, or without understanding that there's a sacrifice required on my part. So that's my first point here. We need to be intentional. We need to think about how we approach God, what our worship of him looks like. And you're all thinking, this is not very much about freedom yet. Hopefully we'll come to that. So you can see this in the second part of the story. A quick look at the second character that I want to draw out from the passage. This man, Obed-Edom the Gittite, the man whose house the ark was placed in after it all seemed to go wrong for David first time round. I wonder how he felt when King David came to his house and said, "We've just had a disaster, a man's died. You're to look after the ark." How do you think he felt? Do you think he'd have been instantly overjoyed at that prospect? How do you think he will have reacted thinking about the ark being in his house with his family? Can you imagine if he had kids of any age? Kids, don't look at the ark. Don't touch the ark. Don't go in the room where the ark is. Look, just don't do it. We all know, anyone who's got kids, no matter what their age, we know what that's like. I bet there was a lot of praying going on. I bet he spent a lot of time on his knees. Please, God, protect my family. I bet he prayed and prayed to God every day, perhaps every moment of every day, for protection for his family. And I'll bet there was a healthy dose of fear of God in his house. And we don't know much about him. He's only mentioned a handful of times here in the parallel story that you can see in the books of Chronicles, and then a few more times in Chronicles. But it says, the result of the time he probably spent praying for protection and seeking out God. The Lord blessed the household of Obed-Edom and everything he had because of the ark of God. I bet there'd been a lot of prayer and worship going on in that house. And the result of that was a great blessing. David was probably jealous when they told him about it. See, David, when this went wrong, he was afraid of the Lord. He was afraid of God. It says it quite clearly in the passage. But Obed-Edom, he had learned the fear of the Lord, which is something different. Fear of God is different to being afraid. The Bible says repeatedly, do not be afraid. It's almost an instruction to us. It's a reassurance, but almost an instruction. Because fear of God is about awe and reverence. Faber, the guy who the great writer of hymns calls it astonished reverence. A.W. Tozer says, anything from the terror of a guilty soul before a holy God to the fascinated rapture of the worshipping saint. He says, the reverential fear of God mixed with love and fascination and astonishment and admiration and devotion is the most enjoyable state and the most purifying emotion the human soul can know. And you can see this kind of awe and reverence and fear of God in lots of places in the Bible, numerous people. Here's a couple of examples. The prophet Isaiah, when he's shown the throne room in his great vision, he says, woe to me, I cried. I am ruined, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty. Or Peter, after the miraculous catch of fish, he says, when Simon Peter saw it, he fell down at Jesus' knees. Go away, he said, leave me, Lord, I am a sinner. Or the Apostle John on the island of Patmos, and what we see in his vision, which is recorded in what we call the book of Revelation. When I saw him, I fell at his feet as though dead. Then he placed his right hand on me and said, do not be afraid, I am the first and the last. And funnily enough, this character Obed-Edom, the other times that we hear about him in the Bible, it's firstly as a temple porter, secondly as a singer in the temple, and the third is as a treasurer in the temple, which are all jobs which would allow him to be in and around the place where the ark was, the place where the presence of God was in the temple. And we can't say for sure much about Obed-Edom, but given the location of his house, and given the fact that his house was a place where the king, where King David, chose to put the ark for safekeeping, he was probably quite a rich man, quite an important man. He probably had some sway. Can't say that for certain, but we can guess. But it seems like he was prepared to put all of that aside and go to do these really quite minor jobs, actually being a porter in the temple, just to be close to the ark, just to be in the presence of God. What about that transformation? John's going to talk about transformation in worship next week. What a difference this made to Obed-Edom in his life. Just to be in the presence of God. See, our worship, it's not for us. It's for God. It's for him. It's not for us. But we benefit anyway. This awe and reverence that we have to have to approach God, this fear of God, that's what leads to freedom in worship. And the freedom of worship that we're trying to talk about today. And it seems like King David learns this, because next time he comes, he's fully prepared. So he comes to bring the ark back from Obed-Edom's house, and he comes with rejoicing this time. This time, he's not afraid, but he fears God. And he comes with that awe and that reverence. And he comes prepared to worship properly and understands that there's a sacrifice required. It's not about him anymore. It's about God. It says, when those who were carrying the ark of the Lord had taken 6 steps, he sacrificed a bull and a fattened calf as that element of sacrifice. And even when they get back to Jerusalem, the first thing he does is sacrifice burnt offerings and fellowship offerings before the Lord. For David, the sacrifices were bulls and fattened calf, burnt offerings and fellowship offerings. For us now, these sacrifices may be an open heart or an open mind, or a laying aside of whatever our own personal idols are, or whatever baggage we're carrying, to approach God in the right way. For us, it might be the choice, like David, to be undignified in our worship of God. And when David approached God in the right way with the right motives, he swept up in free worship. Wearing a linen ephod, David was dancing before the Lord with all his might, while he and all Israel were bringing up the ark of the Lord with shouts and the sound of trumpets. King David leaping and dancing before the Lord. What a great picture. What an amazing picture. This is the King of Israel in his pants, dancing and leaping and praising God as the song goes. What an amazing picture. And he doesn't care how he looks. He says, I will celebrate before the Lord. I will become even more undignified than this, and I will be humiliated in my own eyes. I wonder if we're prepared to be like that. The modern day equivalent of this would be for Queen Elizabeth, the present queen, to be leaping about in her bra and knickers. It's easy to say this is David leaping about in his pants, but when you put it in the context of Queen Elizabeth leaping about in her undies, it's a little bit different. I bet you weren't expecting to have that picture put into your mind when you came to the service this morning. But he's not out of control. David's not out of control here, because freedom in worship's not all about ecstasy, and it's not about losing control. It's not about becoming something that you're not. Because remember when Elijah took on the prophets of Baal, they were free. It says they cried aloud and cut themselves after their custom with swords and lances until the blood gushed out upon them. They were free. It says, but no one answered. But that's not the kind of freedom God's seeking. That's not the kind of freedom that's a fitting worship of the God of creation and of the God of love. It's not what your creator God wants for you. That's not the kind of freedom that we're looking at. Freedom we're talking about here, it's not the freedom to do anything we like. I've already said there are rules about how we approach God. Freedom in worship, it's, amongst other things, it's maybe some of these things. There are probably more. Simon's already said this morning. It's freedom to gather. And let us consider how we may spur one another on towards love and good deeds, not giving up meeting together, as some are in the habit of doing, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching. That's from Hebrews chapter 10. What else is this freedom? It's freedom from sin. It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm then, and do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery. That's from Galatians chapter 5. But most of all, this freedom is the freedom to draw near to God. Therefore, brothers and sisters, since we have confidence to enter the most high place by the blood of Jesus, by a new and living way opened for us through the curtain, that is his body, and since we have a great priest over the house of God, let us draw near to God with a sincere heart and with the full assurance that faith brings. Freedom to draw near to God. What comes from this kind of freedom in worship is the very real presence of God. Since Jesus died for us, so that we could be forgiven for all of the wrong things that are in our lives, all the wrong things that we've done, he's made it possible for us to experience that all of the time. The rules around approaching God are different now because Jesus has opened that up to us. There are still rules. We still have to go with the right heart, with the right mind, and with the right motive. But we don't have to follow a list of prescriptive rules to come into the presence of God, because God is with us always. And what comes out of that? Whereas for King David, as you can see in this passage, it's a very physical overflow from his worship, a blessing on his household and bread and cakes for all of the people of Israel. For us, because of what Jesus did on the cross, our sacrifice and our worship and the overflow from our worship, they all become mixed up in each other. Here's what we read during the opening time of worship. So here's what I want you to do, God helping you. Take your everyday, ordinary life, your sleeping, eating, going to work and walking around life, and place it before God as an offering. Living sacrifice, another version says. Embracing what God does for you is the best thing you can do for him. Freedom in worship. Freedom to draw near to God. The very presence of God in our everyday lives. So we're going to have a chance to respond to this in a time of closing worship. I'm going to ask the band to come up and redecorate a little bit, just while I close out. But in closing, here are some of the questions that this raises for me. Some of the questions that I ask myself when I look at a passage like this and I think about freedom in worship and what it means to give my everyday, day-to-day life to God. There's some what-ifs for you. What if we were to worship with the kind of freedom that David did? What would our life be like? What if we were to thirst for God's presence, like Obed-Edom did? Prepared to put everything aside and what went before just to be in the presence of God? What if we were to humble ourselves before God like David did, and we were prepared to be undignified in our worship of God? What if we were to take God's presence with us everywhere we go and in everything we do? What if we were to listen to the prompts of the Holy Spirit? And what if we were to act and make our everyday, ordinary lives a sacrifice, a living sacrifice, and an offering to God? What would